Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. As a young U.S. diplomat working in Switzerland, Sandra Taylor fell in love with wine while visiting the nearby Burgundy region of France. Sandra is now CEO of Sustainable Business International, a consulting business that assists clients at various stages of environmental sustainability and corporate social responsibility, primarily in the food and beverage sector. Sandra has studied wine extensively for many years. She completed the French Wine Scholars course and is a graduate of the Wine MBA program at the Bordeaux School of Management in France. Sandra has also been a senior executive with the Starbucks Coffee Company, where she led global corporate responsibility and sustainability in coffee supply chain, and with Eastman Kodak Company, where she oversaw global public affairs and corporate citizenship. She continues to speak and teach globally about sustainability in wine, and has literally written the book on sustainability in the wine business. It's called The Business of Sustainable Wine. And it, like Sandra, is a wealth of important information about sustainability in the wine business. We talk about many of the issues around sustainability, including how to define it as more than just a marketing buzzword, why wine is uniquely positioned to capture consumer attention and move all industry towards sustainability, how important it is for the wine industry to set an example of sustainability, and why sustainable practices ultimately result in more delicious wine. Sandra is clearly a brilliant mind who loves wine, and we barely scratched the surface of her extensive knowledge about sustainability in wine. Enjoy. Sandra Taylor, welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast, and thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Mine too. You are the president and CEO of Sustainable Business International, and you wrote the book on sustainability in the wine business. Literally, your book is called The Business of Sustainable Wine: How to Build Brand Equity in the 21st Century Wine Industry, in a 21st Century Wine Industry. And you have some pretty deep experience with sustainability in the business world. Can you, just by introduction, sort of talk about that experience and how your career developed and what led to your interest in directing that sustainability focus toward wine and the wine industry?
Okay. Yeah, I started my career, I have a law degree, but I didn't really want to be a lawyer, not a traditional lawyer. So I went to work for the State Department, U.S. State Department, and I had an assignment overseas in Geneva.
You were
Um,
a diplomat,
I was
or a
a
junior
diplomat.
diplomat,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
that sounds like a fun job.
It really was. I was so the job that took me to Geneva was the title I had was international economist. But
Nice.
I worked on economic and social policy for the US mission to the UN in New York and the US mission to the UN in Geneva. And while in Geneva, I worked on things like law of the sea and probably the precursor, maybe three times removed from the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN has always worked on development in third world countries, emerging democracy, emerging economies. But I was on the weekends. I would go to France with friends, European colleagues, and that's where I kind of fell in love with wine. I didn't know a lot about wine, but I learned a lot, obviously, about wine traveling in Burgundy. So to this day, Pinot
Ooh,
Noir is still probably my favorite wine
yeah.
because I was introduced to it in Burgundy. And so I was a collector, an enthusiast, a hobbyist, I guess, for many years. And at the same time, I was also working on sustainable issues. Left the government and went to work for corporations. And I've been working in this space for a long time. So when I first started, we called it corporate citizenship and eventually corporate social responsibility. And fortunately for me, I worked for a chemical company, so I describe it as being on the dark side. And then I
Mhm.
went to work for Eastman Kodak Company. A lot of that was philanthropy, and Kodak was a great philanthropist. But again, it too was a chemical company. And then I was recruited literally headhunted to Starbucks. And so this was like emerging from the dark to the light, I describe it, because I was hired to run sustainability for Starbucks globally. And that was supply coffee and cocoa and tea supply chains, how to integrate sustainability into those supply chains, corporate giving, community affairs, kind of your traditional CSR role. But I spent a lot of time on coffee and defending the company from fair trade activists, but also figuring out how we could be more responsible because the company was and still remains very committed to being socially responsible and sustainable. So here I was working on a code of conduct for coffee, a way for coffee to be, for the coffee we purchased in Central America, in East Africa, in Indonesia, helping farmers be more environmentally sustainable and socially responsible. And then I started thinking, my favorite fun thing, wine, what's going on in the wine industry? And to my amazement, I discovered there were a lot of similarities between coffee and wine. And that
Yeah,
was kind of how I did it, how I got into it.
that's very cool. Yeah, I mean, just about those similarities, I have a neighbor who's an international coffee consultant, and the more he and I talk, I'm just like, man, that's exactly what we do in wine. Like everything that you're talking about is exactly
Yeah.
what's done in wine, like from the fermentation and different styles of fermentation. Now there's new trends in fermentation, things like that, the way it's tasted and the terroir aspect of it and blind tastings and everything that goes into that. So I imagine that was probably an easy not transition, but just easy overlay onto wine in terms of familiarity and things like that. But then you also went on and got a degree in Bordeaux in
Yeah.
wine business, right?
Yeah. I had worked in business for many, many years, including Starbucks. And when I left Starbucks and decided to start consulting with companies, a variety of companies from different industries, I became a French wine scholar. I took the French wine scholar course the first time it was given in the US, took the exam, all that, and I loved it. So I'm a French wine scholar. Probably know more about French wine than maybe any other type. But I was really excited about wine and wanted to pursue wine, beyond just as a hobby or as a collector. And but I wanted a credential in wine. I didn't want. I would meet so many people in wine shops or at wine tastings who were self appointed experts in wine, and I just didn't want to be one of those. I wanted a credential. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I also was not interested in hospitality. So I'm a business person. I really like the study of business. And also, I just felt like it was an opportunity for me to travel to wine regions to meet wine people. It was an amazing degree. It's the Bordeaux School of Management, it's now part of the Kedge Business School in France. But it's a wine MBA specifically. And it's in English, given in English, and the cohort came from all over the world, from France, from Argentina, from Chile, from Japan, from the US, obviously from Canada. So it was a great cohort. We spent 2 years studying the wine business. So it was a traditional MBA, but all the cases were wine cases because business
Mm.
school it's uses cases to teach business. And also we had to do a thesis, and I did my thesis on sustainability, what motivates sustainability in wine supply chains. So it was academic, so I had to choose. I worked on supply chain theory and a lot of and looked at 7 different regions at the time. And this was 2012, and it was still rather nascent in the industry. The whole certified sustainability was still relatively
Right.
new.
Right. So, and I'm guessing that finding that provided the inspiration then for the book because you saw an opportunity to fill that sort of the gap, that the lack there with great study and great research and putting it out into the world. Is that true?
Yeah, it was. In fact, doing the research for my thesis, I really couldn't find much written about sustainability in the wine industry. So the University of South Australia in Adelaide probably has the best wine research library in the world. And
Mm.
our cohort spent 3 weeks there. So the librarian there was very helpful to me in finding what was available. But there were columns and articles and journal articles, but not many books, and not a lot that was available for the practitioner. So for a new, winemaker or viticulturalist who was interested in exploring sustainability, just wasn't much available for me in doing my thesis. So I spent a lot of time interviewing people and all over the world, wherever I could find them in New Zealand, in South Africa, obviously in California at the Wine Institute. But I felt like there was definitely room for more, and I just decided to write a book, which was, yeah.
I love it. And I'm also taking notes. My wife is a librarian for the city of Los Angeles, and so when we plan trips, it's a combination of where there are really cool libraries that there's also wine. So it sounds like Southeast Australia might be a great place for us to
Yeah,
go visit.
absolutely. Yeah.
Uh, um, well, one of the things I mean, I love your book is so comprehensively researched and laid out. I mean, it's really uh, it's a 101 in sustainability, but it goes much deeper than that. It's a master class as well. So and one of the things that I love, which is one of the simpler aspects of it, is right up front in the introduction, is you talk about the way I put it, why wine is special. And
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I know I always felt that wine was special, like in my belly, but you actually put into words and gave a four-point argument for why wine is uniquely positioned to help steer all agriculture towards sustainability. And all joking aside, that specialness of wine is why I started this podcast.
Mhm.
Can you sort of lay out what those reasons are? Like why is wine uniquely positioned to have this discussion?
Well, I mean, wine is, it's very, of course, widely consumed. And in the US, increasingly, wine is being consumed. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is, I discovered that people, I mean, I knew this, and certainly my study colleagues did, that people want stories. They want the story behind the wine. Even if they don't understand wine, they love to have, where is it from? A lot of people discover wine when they're tourists. So I felt like there was an opportunity to educate people about sustainable agriculture through wine. People
It's
love
like
to drink, people love to drink
yeah,
wine, and so to the extent that the story includes sustainability, then I thought here's an opportunity to educate people about sustainability.
yeah, it's like the one product where there is somewhat of an inherent connection directly to the ground where it was grown in a lot of ways, in the sense that, when we label wine, we give it a place name a lot most of the time, and as well as a year. So there is this sense of a specific connection. Whereas, you buy a head of lettuce or whatever, it could come from any of 100 farms or be shipped across the country or from another country, and you don't know and or care so much as long as it's the lettuce that you're looking for. Um,
Yeah. I
is,
mean,
is that
you're right. And the thing is, wine, it's an agricultural product, but it's a bottled product that can last for decades or more. It retains its identity. So
Mhm.
you can easily compare sustainability from one region to the next.
Mm.
And people really don't care so much about, where did my lettuce come from? I mean, I'm sure there are some people who are that picky or, particular
Sure. I think
about.
more and more people are actually.
Yeah, exactly. And we kind of have to be, sadly, but
Yeah.
for wine, I think whether you care or not, right? You pick up the bottle, it has information about the origin. And so I think it's easy for people to have that kind of, increasingly people want to know, where did this product come from? How were the people treated? Who
Hmm.
produced it? What are some of the conditions, environmental conditions, social conditions in those regions? And it's relatively easy to find that.
Yeah.
If you have a bottle of wine, you can, jump on the internet and get a lot more information about that wine and that region. So that's why I thought, and drinking wine is fun. And so, to the extent that you can integrate stories about sustainability into the story of wine, and winemakers and wineries love to tell stories about their wine and their region and their history.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely know.
Yeah.
uh, so let me just frame everything by asking you, how do you define sustainability? How should we define sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I get asked that all the time because, I mean, to be honest, I hate the term sustainability because it means so many different things, but we're stuck with it. We're stuck with the term. And so, I start with the UN definition. The really was the UN's had a commission that studied sustainable development. And that's the definition that I think we tend to use, was the Brundtland Commission, but it's the using our resources today in a way that conserves resources for the future.
I want to read a quote then, based on that. You used, just to get things rolling here,
Hmm.
from your book.
Okay.
Or maybe actually, I might have taken this from your website. Actually, no, I did.
Okay.
Of all human activity, modern agriculture is the largest single contributor to global greenhouse gas production, to deforestation, and to water consumption. Agriculture affects biodiversity, climate change, waste, soil degradation, and water scarcity. And agricultural workers and farmers often are poorly compensated for their labor while being exposed to some very harmful chemicals. Wine is no exception. Um, so one of the, I mean, you bring up a ton of stuff there, and
Hmm.
I think that is, clearly part of why I think this is, you and I could talk for a long time.
Hmm.
But one of the big issues that I'm just excited to jump right into is this sort of the lacking of the current certifications on all sides. So you can, for example, get certified sustainable, with the California SIP program,
Hmm.
but still use chemicals like Roundup and glyphosate. There's no restriction, so to speak, but there's various grades of phasing out of the more
Hmm.
harmful ones. And then on the other hand, you can get rid of all the harmful chemicals, get certified organic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are thinking about your water conservation and what's happening with your land management, or anything in the adjacent environment, or the way that your workers are being treated and housed and compensated. um, can you talk about some of those limitations,
Yeah.
and the issues, and what we could be, where we need to be headed, basically?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I am such a strong advocate of sustainability is because sustainable certification. Is because I do believe it's more comprehensive and probably leads to many of the results that we want in the sustainability movement, I guess.
Hmm.
That's kind of broadly described the movement. But organic everything, not just wine, but it's all about the forbearance of the use of chemicals. But it doesn't really deal with any of the other aspects of sustainability, as you say, like reducing water use, managing waste, how you treat people, relationships with the communities where you're doing business. So those things are really important, I think, to me. They're important to our future beyond just not using chemicals. I think that's really important. And frankly, I've met some producers in New Zealand in particular who are certified organic and also certified sustainable. To me, that's
Yeah.
kind of ideal, right?
Yeah, that seems like the perfect marriage
Yeah,
now.
exactly. But for, and I get asked, frequently, well, why do sustainable producers get to use chemicals? I mean, you already, wine is wine grapes are notoriously prone to disease.
Yeah.
And so, producers, growers need something to deal with the diseases. Now, fortunately, in the world of organic viticulture, there have been some major developments and innovations. And so now a lot of organic producers have more tools available to them, whereas previously it was just copper and sulfur, which we don't have to get into whether that's good long term for the soil or not. Um,
But
but
we can if you'd like.
yeah, I mean, copper is a heavy metal.
Yeah,
So,
coppers.
it's maybe not a chemical. It's probably as I think as harmful for the soil, but not harmful for the people who use it. Whereas,
Right.
certain chemicals are definitely harmful for workers who are working in vineyards, and so copper does not have that kind of, that harm to the person, but probably long term harm to the soil. Um,
Right.
so so certified sustainable programs do allow spraying. There are, depending on which region, some regions have chemicals that are definitely forbidden, but growers are allowed to use some chemicals. And, the thing about sustainability, and if you talk about the triple bottom line, I mean, I gave you kind of the old definition for sustainability, but these days, we talk about protecting people, planet, but also the economy. And
Yeah.
so producers need to be able to make a living. I mean, if you are an organic producer or a biodynamic producer and you have a really bad year for pest or whatever, mildew, and you don't have tools available to save your crop, it's a really bad year economically for you. Whereas, certified sustainable producers do have some tools they can use to save their crop. And so it's not a total loss. So that's one of the reasons why I like sustainable because, let's face it, this is business, right? You talked about how my book is the business of sustainable wine. We want
Right.
wineries to be successful and vineyards to be successful. So some chemicals can be used now. I think increasingly, because of this push toward sustainability and more judicious use of chemicals, I think chemical manufacturers are starting to be much more responsive. I was at Unified Wine and Grape Symposium one year and did the sustainability tour, of the trade fair, and we visited a lot of producers of chemicals, and I was amazed at how much work is being done. So that one example was that I don't remember the specific product, but you could put one drop on one leaf of a vine and protect the vine. So those are the kinds of things that I think
Wow.
are happening in terms of manufacturing of chemicals for the wine industry. And so you protect the vine, you're not spraying, and but you are protecting your livelihood as well. And then, of
Do you
course, my other concern about organic is that there's no emphasis really on energy reduction, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, or social responsibility to workers or to communities around the vineyards or the winery.
hmm. Yeah, those are good points. I wanted to before I dig into some of the other things you said there, I just found out in an interview with the chief scientist for the Rodale Institute that they've now, you maybe know about this, but they've developed in cooperation with multiple other organizations this regenerative organic certification now that I
Mhm.
think they're really trying to push because they too saw the lack. I mean, I think the way they tell it is when they were going for the organic certification, they had to simplify in order to get it standardized and to get it through the bureaucracy. So they sort of gave up on some of these wider pushes in areas that we're talking about right now. But now they're trying to make that happen. They're trying to make up for those
Mhm.
lacks, and so they're pushing this regenerative organic certification, which um, I'm not sure the full scope of everything that goes into it, but it definitely touches on livestock treatment, animal welfare, as well as the worker welfare and the social welfare involved in agriculture.
Right.
I
And
know. So
deforestation as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
And I wonder. I'm fascinated by this idea that the chemical industry is actually starting to be more responsive. I wonder, I'm a little bit of a cynic, and I'm wondering if it's because they care or because they're seeing more competition from biological, the new tools being developed in the biological sphere where there are more organic tools now, and pretty soon they may see that, unless their chemicals are of comparable safety to the
Hmm.
biologicals that are being developed, they're going to be losing market share before long.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah. I mean, for somebody like me who's worked in this space of social responsibility, sustainability for, so many years, it's hard not to be cynical, right?
Yeah.
So I don't, and actually, I mean, I have, I'm a consultant. I have clients who I know don't care. They don't care, but they are pragmatic business people. They
Yeah.
understand that the competition I've was, this is really more on the social responsibility side. I had a client, a CEO, who said, "I need you to help me figure out help me to determine a signature giving program because I'm trying to recruit all these young MBAs, and they keep asking me what the company's signature giving program is, and I don't even know what that is." So, and they
So
ended up investing quite a bit of money in a great program to help women and girls, around where they do business. Now, does the CEO care? Probably not, but he's pragmatic and he wants to be competitive. And so you're right. I mean, I don't know that they're doing it. Now, I won't say that there aren't some chemical companies that believe that, they have a responsibility for the
right.
future of the planet. But by and large, I would say, they're just trying to make sure they are providing the products that their customers want and need, and their customers want products that are less harmful to the environment. And so that's what they are, putting their R&D people busy on doing,
Well,
so I'll take it. I don't,
no, and I think, really one of the underlying messages that I want to get across by getting the word out through this podcast is the power that we as consumers and individuals have to push things and in a direction to make a difference
yeah,
in a positive sense. And you just spoke to that really clearly. I mean, we can't rely on a top down solution. It comes from everybody making individual choices that show the people at the top that they need to change direction and provide what we're asking for. And I think
right.
that's really inspiring because
Yeah.
it does shows that we can do stuff, just by the kind of wine we buy, for example,
Absolutely.
and
And
the kind
even
of food
within
we
the
eat.
wine industry, I mean, not everybody is sustainable in the industry. I'm excited about how much better organic wine tastes now than it did,
Yeah.
decades ago. And, part of that is just producers needing, better products, paying more attention, getting other kinds of tools available to them. So, yeah, I mean, it's not because consumers want that.
Yeah.
Consumers want, um, we could have a whole debate about whether organic product is healthier for you or for the human or healthier for the planet or both.
Yeah.
But it's what
And
consumers want. Yeah.
yeah, and it's funny there. I know studies are being done to now do trials again at the Rodale Institute. I was just studying them, but they're doing side by side trials now to determine like the nutrition content in and this is produce. Obviously,
Hmm.
wine is a whole different thing, and I
Hmm.
think approaching wine from a health standpoint, I think, is more about the absence of harmful chemicals than
Right.
about like you're going to get stronger and healthier by
Right.
drinking
Exactly.
organic wine.
Yeah.
You just are going to avoid bad chemicals that get sprayed on the grapes and have
Hmm.
residue in the wine. But
Well, I think for and consumers, I don't know that consumers really understand the distinctions between sustainably produced, organic, biodynamic. I think they just want to feel like we're being more responsible in the industry, and it's incumbent on the industry to educate consumers about sustainability. I mean, I think they understand organic because we've been buying organic produce and organic stuff, for quite a while. But I don't think consumers really understand what sustainable wine is. And, happily, a lot of the impetus for sustainability in wine came from within the industry and not from consumers or, activists like
yeah,
coffee. So,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, another great point to underline that the importance of the consumer's choice. And thank you for getting me back on track.
Mhm.
I since you brought it up, how do we I mean I want to talk about a quote from your book.
Okay.
So, and this ties into what you just said. Um this isn't verbatim, but you said wine's essential role is to contribute to the quality of leisure time and social interactions. So, I mean, earlier you talked about, wine is fun. And that's kind of one of its assets, really.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
fun to drink and fun to
yeah.
drink with other people.
Mhm.
And I think the reason this struck me, I'm sure that wasn't a big, profound line for you when you were writing it, but I guess the reason it struck me is because within the wine industry, I think we tend to center we center our marketing and our messaging around very technical aspects of the way wine is grown and produced, made, because it's the center of our world. But for
Mhm.
the consumer, it's not the center of the world. It's more like the cherry or the whipped cream, if you're not into cherries, on the top of their sundae. And so how do we communicate? How do we in the wine industry, who are trying to you know run truly sustainable businesses, um, effectively communicate the sustainable values that we're producing our wine to customers, and bridge that gap, between what their priorities are and what our priorities are,
Yeah.
as well as address some of the confusion that you talked about between all these various certifications that all of them need some level of explanation to dig into really vital aspects of how they're different, which
Mhm. Yeah, I think probably for millennials, I've been lately been kind of exploring kind of natural wines and the raw wine festivals. I think millennials care about all of those aspects of sustainable production. What were the chemicals that were used? How were the people treated? Whereas, maybe their parents' generation didn't care so much about that. So they do care about those things. And so the industry has to figure out a way to communicate those beyond taste. I mean, I'm not going to disparage natural wine, but there's a big difference between, some of the natural wines I've tasted and some of these fine Bordeaux wines or, Oregon Pinots or, there's a difference in the taste to me, the taste
Mhm.
profile. So I think increasingly consumers care about many of those aspects as much as they do taste.
Yeah.
Although I participated, I've been traveling everywhere, and I've been talking, last week was talking to some Italian producers. And, one of the things they talk about is that we don't stress the sensory aspects of sustainability enough.
Yeah.
That, we can't, that it could become boring to consumers to talk about, oh, the energy that was we didn't use, or energy reduction, or chemicals that we didn't use, or it's kind of a downer, kind of
Yeah.
a negative story. It's about climate change, it's about chemicals, it's about, the poor workers, seasonal labor. So how do we make sure that, and those are important, how do we measure who's doing what on those various aspects of wine production? But I think we also have to stress the sensory aspects, the beautiful landscapes where the wine comes from, the culture that's associated with production. Especially in many parts of the world where wine has been produced for centuries. So, yeah, I think we've got to figure out a way to do both, and fortunately, for I think increasingly Americans are starting to consume wine with food. That's not
Yeah.
been the tradition. And the more that we, talk about which wine goes with what food, I think, you can weave in a sustainability story, as well as this wine is going to taste great with your turkey, at Thanksgiving,
Right.
or, beef stew when it's cold, whatever. So yeah, so combining the sensory aspects with some of these sustainable attributes, I think, is going to be very critical. And maybe we'll get to a point where we don't even have to talk about it when, everybody's sustainable.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh God, that's my Imagine
I
song.
know, imagine, yeah, exactly.
Well, do you have any? I mean, and I just want to clarify. When you talk about the sensory aspects. Are you saying how the agriculture directly relates to the quality of the wine in the bottle at the
Yeah,
end of the day? And do
yeah,
we do and as opposed to just like any wine obviously has sensory aspects, and we should talk about its fruit flavors or its textures or its, those kind of things. You're talking about
mhm,
specifically how does our farming ultimately impact the complexity, the textures, everything the flavors in the wine. And
yeah.
do you have any data about that, or have you seen any studies about that?
I've seen some studies. I haven't, I keep trying to get winemakers to, admit that if the wine is biodynamic, it tastes, I don't want to say tastes better, but that it better reflects the terroir, that it reflects the place
Hmm.
that it comes from, the place where the grapes were grown. I do believe that. And I think, winemakers, they're hesitant to do that because, it starts to sound like then conventional wine isn't good, right? So, but I do believe that. I definitely think some biodynamic wines really are just amazing, and
Well,
an amazing representation of the place where they're produced.
yeah, and I think more and more the where we're finding some of the connection there is the in the soil science, where when you have a microbially diverse soil, that results in more pheromones and terpenes and all the things that we actually do sense in the grapes. Like there's a greater communication from the soil to the grapes, and that
Mhm.
actually can translate directly into the wine. And I
Yeah,
think the science is now sort of backing that up.
yeah.
um, and it's only a matter of time, I think, before there are some sensory comparative things too. Of course, you don't totally destroy soil microbiology by farming conventionally, so there's always going to be great tasting conventional wines, I'm
Mhm.
imagining. Um but yeah, I think, at least scientifically, we have some evidence to point in that direction. already, which is exciting for
Yeah, it
me.
is exciting. Yeah. So, I mean, I believe that, and I do. You're right. I mean, there are some conventional, I think we're all going to come to a place. There are conventional producers who use techniques that are used in biodynamic production, that maybe are used in organic production, certainly, in sustainable production to enliven the soil, bring life to the soil. So, yeah, it's the lines between conventional and sustainable. We'll just use sustainable as a large category of organic
Okay.
biodynamic. I think the
Yeah.
lines are going to be blurred between those, but I definitely think some of the biodynamic producers, you can just taste a quality of the wine that you wouldn't taste in that same conventional wine, maybe from that same region. And I drink all kinds of wine, so I'm not saying that I don't. I think there are some fine wines from Bordeaux. Bordeaux is notorious for their
Yeah.
spraying of chemicals, um,
Right.
because it's traditional. But I do think that just the attention that's paid to the production of the wine kind of shines through as well. So there's not a lot of manipulation. Maybe there were chemicals sprayed in the vineyard, but there's not a lot of manipulation of the wine in the winery. So all of those things, that care. I mean, one of my favorite wines is Pontet Canet, and
Mm.
not that I can afford much Pontet Canet, but when I
I
was
hear you.
doing my thesis, it was the first person. Jean-Michel Combe was the first person I interviewed, and Ponte Canet is biodynamic. They don't talk about it very much.
Oh
They're
yeah.
starting to do it a little bit more, but my conversation with him and with others. I mean, there are biodynamic producers in Oregon that I speak with as well and spend time with. I just think they spend a lot more time in the vineyard and with the vines, and that there's a lot of care and attention that they give, which may also explain why those wines have such a quality of flavor. It won't say they
Right.
taste better, but it's also care and attention in the vineyard as well.
Well, you brought up Punta Cana, and then your website lists a lot of your favorites. I think a very great list of internationally from California to France to New Zealand and Australia, everywhere. Uh, People who are doing great farming and
Mhm.
making great wines. I remember. I mean, I think that's just a great resource if anybody wants some ideas to start
Yeah,
with your website. And what can you just which website is that on that I'm talking
it's
about? Is that
it's discoversustainablewine.com.
that's it? Okay, different from your business website.
Yeah, because my
But
business website, covers a bunch of different industries, although, more and more I'm just working in wine, which is great. Which is fun. But, when I
you're
started my consulting, obviously I worked with, I worked with coffee companies. I worked with a variety of companies. I've done some work for chocolate companies, chocolate manufacturers, or I guess cocoa powder manufacturers. But now, increasingly, I'm doing more and more work in wine.
well, and I want to go back. You also, in talking about Bordeaux, you talked about how much they have sprayed, and I remember from your book you talk about um, a lawsuit that happened there where a worker, I believe it was Bordeaux,
That was
where a
Burgundy.
worker
Yeah, yeah, that
that
was
was Burgundy.
Burgundy.
Okay, where
Yeah,
somebody who got sick from the sprays
yeah,
successfully sued the winery.
the winery. Yeah, and
And
yeah.
yeah, go ahead if you want to.
No, but in Bordeaux, I mean, I think, it's been documented that Bordeaux producers spray more than almost any other region. Um,
Yeah.
and there have been protests, really amazing protests,
Yeah.
lions, they've called them, where they literally lie in the streets.
Oh wow.
Protesters, there's been a couple of really um, well. well done documentaries that have aired, on French television about the impact of spraying of pesticides in the wine region and children who become sick in schools nearby from spraying. And it really, it's not required to spray that much. I mean, you talk to some producers and they say, well, this is how my daddy did it. This is how my grandfather did it. This is how we do it
Yeah.
here. There's that tradition. And it requires, I mean, the California Wine Institute, the Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, did a lot of work of educating producers. The same thing happened with Sustainable Wine New Zealand. It's not just about certification, it's also educating producers, growers, and winemakers and wineries about, the impact of spraying and how it just really isn't, it's not always required to spray as much as winery or viticulturalists have sprayed. It's just not always but that's just been a tradition, and I think just documenting when you spray, how much you spray, where you spray, has really focused producers, let's say in California or in the so-called New World, um, to the need, whether you really need all that.
Right.
Um,
To
yeah,
spray less and spray more effectively, to time
right,
it. They know the cycles of the pests and the fungal infections,
right.
and they can like dial in that spray to time it perfectly, so they're much more effective and efficient.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, I had a
um,
producer in New Zealand say to me, "Well, I only use Roundup once. I do once, once a season. I use Roundup, and then that's it. I don't do it anymore." So I've learned, I don't use the Roundup as much. And then another one I visited, also in New Zealand, and the whole time we were talking, I could hear like a lawnmower going, and he said, "Oh, that's our intern from Italy, and this is what he does all day. He whacks weeds because we don't use any chemicals." So,
right.
it's labor
That's a
intensive.
great internship.
Yeah,
I mean, because it's tedious, but you can feel like you're saving the planet at the
yeah.
same time.
Absolutely. It's labor intensive, but it's so in other words, we have choices, and
Yeah.
we make choices that are easy sometimes, and then we make choices that are more responsible.
Well, so one big issue that I wanted to talk about was just worker treatment in the wine industry, and just the labor aspect. I feel like, I don't know if you'd agree, but it seems like one of the larger areas for improvement. And I know California has been through a reckoning in some ways, in terms of just having regulations and from the EPA and from the labor
Mhm.
department, that anybody who's working in California is protected by some of the best, employment laws in America, at least. But what could we be doing better in that realm? And
Yeah.
I sort of have a theory that a bigger reckoning hasn't happened, of course, because we have a labor force that's culturally very separate from the ownership, and so there's a big divide there, and that results in people who are more afraid to speak out, maybe don't
Mhm.
even speak the same language, and therefore there's not going to be lawsuits related to these things. But I'm guessing you might even have some statistics about worker illnesses and cancers and things that develop from these sprays that we're using, that to the extent that they're reported, show a clear pattern of what we're doing in the vineyard and what's happening to the people who are working in the vineyard.
Yeah.
Can
I
you
mean,
talk about that?
yeah, I actually don't have much in the way of statistics related specifically to wine. There's, obviously statistics you can find in California about kind of seasonal labor and migrant labor and, the impact, health impacts, that sort of thing. But I think anecdotally, um, producers know what's happening. Sadly, I mean, I was in Oregon, I guess last summer, not this past summer. Nobody's been anywhere this past summer. But, and there was a lot of concern about the fact that the labor wasn't available even because of our immigration laws.
Right.
But also when you travel in California, a lot of the workers are not illegals. They have
Right.
been living in California or in the wine regions for decades, if not longer. So, there are some examples of some wineries that are really trying hard to do the right thing to, give training in Spanish and in English for how to use equipment and how to use, chemicals. Um, and I think more of that has to happen. And then there, the kind of the horror stories you hear about housing of workers, and the Sonoma growers have really taken this on, and have been building decent housing for workers, which I think is, the it's the least we can do, honestly. But there are issues everywhere in the world, not just here. We know about them because we hear about stories of what happens to agricultural workers in California, seasonal labor. But seasonal labor is everywhere. There are issues about Greek workers in Europe, and some who come to Bordeaux. There are other issues in Italy about very poor people who are working the harvest and who are not treated well. So,
Yeah,
we
there was a
really
big.
have to, as an industry, we need to do a lot more in terms of social responsibility. Um,
Are
yeah.
are there any wine producing regions that you would raise a red flag about in terms of poor worker treatment?
Yeah.
Or is it more producer dependent rather than regional?
No, it's South Africa, you know.
South Africa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely South Africa. And even their Human Rights Watch did a study of sort of labor conditions in the fruit industry, but they specifically identified wine grapes as well. There's some really horrible stories. It's changing somewhat, but not nearly fast enough. So in South Africa, a lot of the workers' housing is tied to their employment.
So
So
it's almost like indentured servitude.
yeah, so if you live on the property or you live nearby, and if you no longer work there, then you can't live there anymore.
Oof.
So that's those kinds of stories. So you're tied to that producer, and really don't have any power or leverage. There were actually Human Rights Watch, and I don't know, that was a few years ago, but there are actually cases where people were being paid in brandy, really, harsh brandy. Some, currency, but also maybe, 75% money and 25% brandy, which,
Oh
you
boy.
know, it's not healthy. And so
Yeah.
yeah, so I would say that South Africa, and they're trying, when I talk to producers, they like to say, oh, there's a few bad apples, few bad producers, but they did take it upon themselves to create a new kind of code of conduct related to labor in the wine industry, and it requires supply chain sustainability. So they, to be certified sustainable under this labor initiative, your entire supply chain has to be certified sustainable in terms of labor. So I think that's positive, and they're trying really hard to enforce it. Their Systembolaget, which is the Swedish retailer, wine and spirits retailer, happens to be the largest wine and spirits retailer in the world, just because it's a monopoly. It's a state store, basically.
Got it.
And there's a
Okay.
lot of consumption, too. But they
Right.
have spent a lot of time in South Africa, literally sending delegations there to observe and make sure that they are following this new. It's called WITA, the Wine Industry Ethical Trade Initiative. I think that's what that stands for. And so the Scandinavians are really, they don't just rely on producers saying, oh, we signed it and we did it. They literally send delegations to the country to observe and do their own, in-person research. So that's one extreme. That's probably the worst in terms of regions. I think, on the opposite end, Chile has a real, their program is one of the newest certification programs, and they have a requirement that producers to be certified must show that they have a management policy of social responsibility. They can't just say, oh, we've got a social responsibility manager. They need to know that you have really integrated this into your operation, and there are ways that they try to document that. And then on the another one is New Zealand, and New Zealand is unique because they have labor shortages in New Zealand. And so
Yeah.
they too import labor to work the harvest, but they've done it in a way. They work with the development agency of New Zealand. They recruit people from the Pacific to come, and they come often. The same workers come every year. They return home. They make a commitment that some of their earnings will go to a social project back home. And so over time, they become very knowledgeable about the wine industry. But then they go back home and they take the resources back home to improve the situation. So that's what I really like. I like talking about that one because I think it's positive.
That's great. Yeah, I would love to end on a positive note. And there's so many things that I don't want to take your time to ask, but I'd love to talk to you about just things like I think you're a fan of Oregon Pinot, and I'd love to get your take on Oregon versus Burgundy and your experiences there. But also I wanted to point out some fun things from your book. I love that you have these sort of surprising things where it's like the use of French oak barrels actually can be carbon negative just by over the studies that have been done. I think that's one of the things that you talk
Yeah.
about, and then this really fascinating thing that there's sort of this line that divides the U.S. starting middle Ohio and ending sort of in coastal Texas, where if you're west of it, it is a smaller carbon footprint to buy West Coast wine, and if you're east of it, it's a smaller carbon footprint to buy wine imported from France. Even is
Well, yeah,
did I get that
you kind of the
close to
opposite. Yeah. So because wine from California is trucked across the country.
right?
And wine from Europe that comes into the East Coast, and I think we probably drink more European wines on the East Coast anyway, maybe because of this, but it comes by ship.
Right,
And
which
so
is
there's less of a carbon footprint for that
right.
wine that comes by ship from Europe to the East Coast versus wine that comes from the West Coast by truck across the country to Ohio, Illinois. The Wine Institute likes to take issue with that, but you know,
Well, it's an interesting tidbit.
yeah,
I'm sure it's one study. I'm sure there are other things and complications that are
yeah.
out
There's
there as
so
well.
we could do another podcast just on climate because there's so many ways in which the wine industry can reduce its own carbon footprint, though it's largely impacted by carbon emissions that are not of the industry's own making.
Hmm.
But, so the industry has to also be advocates for, climate action by government. But at the same time, there are a number of things that the industry can do itself to reduce its carbon footprint. And one, I'll just give you one, is lighter
Yeah,
weight
please.
bottles. Lighter weight
Later.
bottles.
Yep.
There's no
Absolutely.
reason why wine has to be in heavy bottles. And unfortunately, less expensive wine typically is in heavier bottles because it gives the impression that it's a better quality wine. Um,
Right.
yeah, it's not required. A lighter weight
Not
bottle does not break. And the Systembolaget and the Canadian, again, monopoly state stores are requiring, they will only put wines on their shelf that have a certain bottle weight.
or
So,
below, right? It's
yeah,
like a maximum bottle
yeah,
weight. That's fantastic. I
yeah, it's
think
great.
that's really
I
smart.
love that. Another positive
Yeah.
story. Yeah,
Yeah, like we like to say it's what's in the bottle, not the bottle, that's important.
exactly. Yep.
Yeah, so just to send us off, what other, I mean, what if there's one or two big changes that you think, are the greatest opportunities or for the wine industry, or just that you'd like to see in the next few years, what would those be?
Yeah, so energy reduction, when I, a lot of producers in France say, easy for you Americans to say because you're building newer wineries and we have, older wineries and it's not, but solar, you can add solar power, solar panels. So I think just more responsible energy usage would be something that I think the wine industry needs to take on. Obviously, understanding dry farming because
Mm,
drought, we're stuck. I think we're going to be stuck with drought, on the West. And certainly there's drought in Argentina, there's drought in many regions as well. So starting to understand dry farming better
yeah,
is a way. And then there's a lot of great research that's being done on the microbiome, and are there some ways in which we can reduce the temperature of the vine below ground so that even with rising temperatures, the vine is not as affected. Some very interesting research being done in Napa and in Italy by
yeah.
growers. Yeah,
Cover crops are
and
a
cover
huge
crops.
part of
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard studies where it's like a 30-degree temperature drop if
Yeah,
you
and
just
that's
keep a
so
cover crop.
easy. And cover crops,
Yeah,
so it's a reduction in the temperature, but it's also, um, requires less use of, herbicides or fertilizers. There's a lot of, natural nutrients that will can be retained in the soil using cover crops, and that's something a lot of conventional producers are using as well. So that's one of
yeah,
those techniques that started, within in the sustainable wine world that now is being used very widely, I think, by producers, conventional producers.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for this. How can we learn more about you and what you're doing, or if somebody wants to get in touch with you for whatever reason, do you want them to?
Yes.
And how would they do that?
I definitely want them to. So, I mean, I do. I mean, I'm on Twitter, so at Wine Sustainable. I'm also at San Eliz Taylor, Saneliz Taylor, Taylor. My website is Discover Sustainable Wine. You can write me at Sandra at discoversustainablewine.com. So those
Got it.
are all the ways you can find me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra. This has been fantastic. And like I said, I feel like we barely scratched the surface, but I got to let you go
Thank
and
you
be
so much,
respectful
Adam.
of your
I know, and
time.
you can tell I love talking about all these subjects.
As
So,
totally, as do I. Well,
yeah,
thank you so much.
thank you.
We'll do it again,
Okay,
hopefully.
good. All right, bye bye.
Bye. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Sandra Taylor as much as I did. Thank you so much for listening. I definitely don't take your time and attention for granted. I'm Adam Huss, the creator and producer of the Organic Wine Podcast. And unlike many other podcasts, we don't ask for donations. But if you value this podcast and want to support it, the easiest and most yummy way to do that is to buy a bottle of Centralis wine. Centralis is the winery that I started with my wife, Wendy, and it is dedicated to sustainable organic values, transparency, and inclusion. One of the ways Centralis promotes those values is by supporting this podcast. So if you buy Centralis wines, you get delicious wine, and you support this podcast at the same time. You can buy Centralis wines at centraliswine.com. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. Thank you.